In this second part, we continue with the remaining elements of the coffee chocolate entremet. I'll show you how to make a concentrated coffee extract for an intense soak, talk through the challenges of assembling an entremet with visible layers and a crunchy insert, go over proper mise en place for clean assembly, and finish with a detailed look at a pâte bombe chocolate mousse. I hope you will learn as much from this process as I did while analyzing my mistakes during the preparation. Before we start the coffee soak, we're going to make a simple coffee paste from scratch. We need just three ingredients. Some sugar. We'll first caramelize the sugar, then deglaze it with a mixture of water and instant coffee. We will let it reduce by half, creating a rich coffee infused paste. First, mix the instant coffee with water and give it a good stir until it's fully dissolved. Then bring it to a boil in the microwave and keep it hot while we make the caramel. This way, the caramel won't seize up when we deglaze it. To make caramel, you need a heavy bottomed pan so the heat is distributed evenly. I'll be using the dry caramel method, which means no water is added. With this method, the sugar is melted in portions over medium heat. You can stir the caramel since there is no water involved. Just be sure to use a heat-resistant spatula. I've learned a lot of caramel in the past, so what I'm showing you here is a method I've learned through trial and error. I start by adding a small amount of sugar to a heavy bottomed pan and let it melt completely before adding more. This step is important. Each new portion of sugar melts into sugar that's already caramelized, and that caramelized sugar is extremely hot. I'm cooking on induction, and my induction is quite strong, so I constantly adjust. If I notice the sugar getting darker on one side of the pan, I lift the pan off the heat, and the residual heat is usually enough to continue caramelizing the sugar, but much more gently and evenly. The challenge is controlling the heat. You want the new sugar to melt without burning the caramel that's already formed at the bottom of the pan. This is where caramel can go from perfect to burnt very quickly, so color is your best guide. One very important thing to remember about caramel is sugar crystallization. Here on the bottom, you see sugar crystals that are not melted. If you leave even a few unmelted sugar crystals in the caramel, over time they can cause the entire caramel to turn grainy. Those crystals act like seeds and encourage the caramelized sugar to return to its original crystal form. That's why I always check the bottom and the sides of the pan, making sure there are no dry or partially melted sugar crystals sticking there. Taking the time to melt everything completely is essential. This small detail makes a big difference in the final texture of your caramel. Once I'm sure there are no sugar crystals left, it's time to deglaze the caramel. Deglazing simply means stopping the cooking of the sugar by adding a liquid or fat like butter or cream. I do this off the heat for safety. Here I am adding a hot instant coffee solution and I add it in small portions. This is very important because adding too much liquid at once can create a lot of steam and that steam can easily burn your hands. By adding the liquid gradually, I keep the reaction under control while fully dissolving the caramel. Always step back slightly and stay aware. Caramel is extremely hot and safety matters just as much as technique. Back on medium heat, I reduce the caramel by about half, stirring constantly. As it cooks, you'll notice the bubbles becoming slower and thicker, and the texture turning more glossy and syrupy. Stirring is essential at this stage to prevent the caramel from sticking to the bottom of the pan or cooking unevenly. This reduction concentrates the flavor and smooths out the caramel, giving it a deeper taste and a more controlled consistency. Once the caramel is ready, I transfer it to a heat-resistant container and you can store it at room temperature for up to 3 months. For the coffee soak, we need the coffee paste that we've just prepared. As it cools, it becomes quite thick and sticky, so I will warm it slightly in the microwave to make it easier to scrape into the pan. Next, I'll make a simple syrup by combining water, the warmed coffee paste, and sugar. This creates a concentrated, flavorful base. At the very end, I'll add some strong espresso to intensify the coffee flavor and give the soak a rich aromatic depth. When making syrups, I always start with water first and then add the sugar. This prevents the sugar from sticking to the bottom of the pan and burning. Then I scrape in the coffee paste. I like to start cooking the syrup over a low heat to make sure all the sugar dissolves evenly. Once everything is fully combined, I bring the mixture to a good steady boil over high heat, then remove it from the heat. This method ensures a smooth, well integrated syrup with no undissolved sugars. Once the syrup is off the heat, I add some strong espresso and our coffee soak is ready. Before you start assembling the mousse, make sure your mold is ready and properly lined. Place it on a tray that can easily go into the freezer. Choosing the right tray beforehand makes the assembly much smoother. Here is a point I haven't fully resolved yet, and I want to be honest about it. This entremet is meant to show its layers. There is no glaze, no velour, and no outer mousse to hide anything. And traditionally visible layer entremet are trimmed once fully frozen to get clean edges. I tried that, but the crunchy layer between the mousse layers crushed and fractured the surrounding mousse, so trimming wasn't an option. So that's why I'm assembling it in a square ring lined with acetate. I fold the acetate into the corners, but because it's quite thick, it curls back on itself, which makes achieving perfectly sharp corners even more difficult. At the time of filming, I hadn't decided whether I would trim the entremet, so I made the crunchy layer slightly smaller than the mousse, but not a full centimeter from each edge. The book says it should match the mold, but in practice, making it smaller helps prevent fracturing and allows safe trimming. I truly recommend trimming the crunchy layer about 1 centimeter from each side. This keeps the mousse edges cleaner and gives you the option to trim safely if needed. Cut the joconde sponge to the size of the mold. I'm not pressing the sponge with the ring because that would crush it, and on the size of the entremet, you wouldn't see the full height of the sponge, and mousse can flow into any slope this creates. In the video, I'm cutting the sponge using the interior of the ring as a guide, but this leaves a small gap of a few millimeters which lets the mousse seep in. For cleaner edges, I recommend trimming the sponge using the exterior of the ring as a guide. You see, there are so many little details like this that affect the final appearance of the layers. I trimmed the size of the fresh sponge sheet because we only want the porous parts that will absorb the soak. The trimmed edges are a bit overworked and have a thin skin, which would prevent proper soaking. Here we need two sponge layers, so to maximize yield, I place a leftover sponge side by side with a fresh sheet, and this way I can reduce waste. One important thing to keep in mind when working with entremet is that the moment you fold the mousse, you need to start the assembly right away because mousse sets quite quickly. That's why everything must be ready in advance. Your mold is lined, inserts are prepared, and sponges cut to the correct size. I keep all these elements in the freezer until the moment of assembly. One last step before starting the mousse is applying a thin layer of chocolate to the Ricon sponge. This isn't mentioned in the book, but based on my experience with opera cake, where the sponge is generously soaked with coffee syrup, I always apply a thin layer of chocolate to the bottom of the sponge. In French, this is called chablonnage. It creates a protective barrier that strengthens the sponge, making it much easier to handle, especially since a soaked sponge becomes very fragile. Here I apply a line of melted chocolate and use a palette knife to spread it evenly over the sponge. When you approach the edge, tilt your palette knife and make a scraping motion so the chocolate stays on the sponge and doesn't overflow. This is actually the same movement used when applying chablonnage in enrobed bonbon production, and it's a practical technique that's worth mastering. I clean the sides and keep it in the fridge until assembly. I'm making a chocolate pâte bombe mousse. For this, we need cold heavy cream, another portion of cream to make a dark chocolate ganache, and ingredients to make the pâte bombe. So it's egg yolks, water, and sugar. It's essentially egg yolks whipped with hot sugar syrup, similar to Italian meringue, but with yolks instead of whites. When making mousse, we always start by whipping the heavy cream first. We want it semi-whipped, a state where the cream has body but doesn't cling to the whisk and shows no peaks. The longer you whip, the warmer it becomes, and it's important to remember that it's the fat particles that trap the air, and warm fat can't hold air properly. To prevent this, whip at high speed, and if your kitchen is warm, chill the bowl and mix or whisk beforehand. This keeps the cream cool and stable, allowing it to hold as much air as possible. Semi whipped cream contains the maximum amount of air. Shortly after this stage, the cream starts gaining more body, which actually pushes the air out. In mousse, we always have an aerated element. It's the air that makes mousse light and melt in the mouth. If you overwhip or underwhip the cream, you lose air. That directly affects the texture. The mousse becomes denser with less volume and less expressive in flavor. Texture is how we convey flavor, so paying close attention to the cream at this stage is essential. Take a closer look at the texture of semi-whipped cream. Cream has body, but it doesn't hold on the whisk. Now keep it aside in the fridge. I need to make a dark chocolate ganache with a final temperature of around 45-50 degrees. And to do this, I'll half melt the chocolate in the microwave in 15-second increments, stirring well in between. And meanwhile, I bring the heavy cream to a simmer. So that's when you will see small bubbles forming at the edges of the pan. Ganache is an emulsion, which means it's a stable structure of fat and liquid. To create it, liquid needs to be incorporated into the chocolate gradually. I start by adding half of the hot cream, stirring only in the center until a shiny core appears. That shine is the sign that the emulsion is forming, and once it's there, I can add the remaining liquid. By working the spatula in the center, each movement pulls a little more liquid into the emulsion and gradually building a smooth, stable ganache. In this mousse, the ganache acts as the base into which all the aerated elements will be folded. How well this emulsion is made directly affects the final texture of the mousse. If the ganache is grainy, meaning the fat and liquid have split and the emulsion has broken, the mousse will also be grainy and won't have that smooth melt in the mouth texture. No matter how fast we stir by hand, we can't achieve a perfectly stable emulsion. It's the stick blender that truly perfects the emulsion, breaking it down at a microscopic level. That's why I always prefer to finish the ganache with a blender. It gives a smoother texture and a much more stable base for the mousse. Emulsify the ganache until it's completely smooth and shiny, then set it aside. In the traditional pâte bombe method, sugar syrup cooked to 118 degrees is poured over egg yolks to pasteurize them, then whipped to the ribbon stage. With the very small quantities we are working with here, cooking a syrup that precisely is difficult and easy to overshoot, so instead we use the sabayon method. The egg yolks, sugar, and water are combined and then cooked together over a bain-marie to 82 degrees, then whipped until light and airy. 82 degrees is the temperature of the pasteurization. As always, we don't let the sugar and egg yolks sit together for long. Make sure to whisk them immediately after combining. Sugar pulls moisture from the yolks, which can create dry spots and later lead to a grainy texture. For the bain-marie, the water should be gently simmering and the bowl must not touch the water. Whisk continuously until the mixture reaches 82 degrees, then remove it from the heat. I'll whip the pâte bombe in the same bowl because transferring it to a stand mixer bowl can cause the temperature to drop too much, and while whipping you can help it stay warm by gently heating the sides of the bowl with a heat gun. We want the whipped pâte bombe to reach around 45 degrees. One side note here, just after removing the pâte bombe from the heat, I took the semi-whipped cream out of the fridge to let it warm slightly. I'll explain the logic behind this later once all three elements of the mousse are ready. I keep whipping the pâte bombe at high speed until it reaches the ribbon stage, the same stage we saw with whipped eggs in part 1 of this video series. This is the ribbon stage. When you lift the whisk, the mixture leaves a visible trail on the surface that doesn't disappear immediately. Now we have the three elements of the chocolate mousse: semi-whipped cream, ganache, and pâte bombe. The ganache is the base, which will be aerated with the other two. My ganache has cooled, so I gently warm it to 45 degrees in the microwave in 5-second increments. Ganache and pâte bombe are at 45-50 degrees and the cream around 8-12 degrees. These temperatures prevent the cream from melting and the chocolate from seizing, ensuring a smooth mousse. As usual, when combining three different textures, we first lighten the thickest element, which is a ganache. To do this, we sacrifice a small portion of the aerated elements. I start by putting in the pâte bombe first so the ganache doesn't seize from direct contact with the cream. I use a whisk instead of a spatula, not to preserve air, but simply to bring the ganache to a consistency similar to the other two elements. The setting agent is cocoa butter, which starts to set below 26 degrees. That's why the ganache and pâte bombe are kept at 45-50 degrees and the cream slightly warmer, around 8-12 degrees. If the cream is too cold, the cocoa butter would seize, giving a grainy mousse. And keeping the base warm lets us fold everything together smoothly without melting the cream or letting the cocoa butter set too quickly. Once all three elements have a similar consistency, their order doesn't matter. We fold everything together with the spatula, preserving air as much as possible with a minimum of movements. Pay close attention to how the airy mixtures are combined to preserve as much air as possible. Work from the center down to the bottom of the bowl, then up the sides, turning the bowl as you go. Overmixing will knock out the air, and in mousse, air is what defines both texture and flavor in the mouth. Once there are no white streaks left in the chocolate mousse, stop mixing, it is ready.